everyone, welcome back to my channel for a brand new mystery with Molly. If you are new around here, if you have never seen my face before, then hi, my name is Molly and I post true crime videos like this every single week. So if you think that is something that you might want to stick around for, then please do subscribe and don't forget to switch on the little notification bell so that YouTube will notify you every time that I post. But anyway, this week we are going to be talking about the solved case of Mabel Leyshon, an elderly woman who was viciously murdered in a random and frenzied attack. The police investigating this case struggled to find Mabel's killer for a little while. However, when they were eventually identified, the whole community was just in complete shock when they found out who had done this. And they weren't just shocked by who the killer was, they were also shocked by the killer's motive for the murder. It's honestly one of the most insane motives I've ever heard. But before we get into today's case, I do just want to say a huge thank you to NordVPN for kindly sponsoring this video. A VPN, for those of you who don't know, is a virtual private networking service which basically allows you to access the internet safely by protecting your personal data and hiding your IP address from potential hackers. It works by masking your location. With NordVPN, you can change country, giving the impression that you're somewhere else in the world. And not only does this help to protect your online identity, but it also means that you can access websites that are not accessible in your region. I'm constantly using NordVPN when I'm researching because a lot of the time when I'm looking into cases from other countries, I am unable to view some of the news articles because they're blocked in my area. But with NordVPN, I can just change my location and then I'm able to view them. I also love using NordVPN to access different countries' Netflix libraries. It's honestly become an obsession of mine to browse through the different Netflix libraries and see what kind of content they have. And I was so happy when I saw that the Australian Netflix still has Gossip Girl. I love Gossip Girl so much, but it was recently removed from the UK Netflix and I was so sad about it. And I was looking into buying the box set, but then I realised I could just use NordVPN to watch it on the Australian Netflix. NordVPN is compatible with most operating systems including Windows, macOS, Linux, iOS and Android, and they also offer a 30-day money-back guarantee. So if you would like to give it a try, then you can go to nordvpn.com/Molly or use my code, which is just Molly, to get a 2-year plan with a huge discount plus 1 additional month for free. Once again, a massive thank you to NordVPN for sponsoring this video and supporting the channel. And now let's just get into today's case. Just quickly, I want to let you guys know that the theme of suicide is mentioned in this video. I think it will be about halfway through, so that's just a trigger warning if you are sensitive to that topic. So for today's case, we are going all the way back to the year 2001 in Anglesey, which is an island off the northwest of Wales in the UK. Specifically, this case took place in a village in Anglesey that is actually known worldwide for its extremely long name. I believe it is the longest place name in Europe, and I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce it because I will get it wrong, but I will put the name of the village on screen. There are shortened versions of the name, but I don't even think I'd be able to pronounce those, so I do apologise, but like I said, I'll put the name of the village on screen. Actually, what I'll try to do is I'll try to find a clip of someone saying the name, and I'll insert it now if I can.
It's known worldwide, isn't it, because of the long name, being Llanfair, Pwllgwyngyll, Gogerch, Wyrndrobwll, Llantysilio, Gogogoch.
Despite its really long name, it's actually a pretty small village in Anglesey and it's a really nice place to live. It's one of those places where everyone knows everyone, a very friendly area with a real sense of community. The whole Anglesey Island is just really lovely. It's a tourist hotspot. Many people love to go there on holiday, but most of the people that actually live there are people that have always lived there. All their lives, they've always lived in Anglesey and they love it. The majority majority of the people that live in this little village in Anglesey where this case took place are elderly people, and they always loved it because they just always felt so safe there. Crime rates were pretty low, there wasn't much violence, so they always felt comfortable and protected. And one of its elderly residents was Mabel Leyshon, a 90-year-old woman who of course had lived on the Isle of Anglesey all her life. Mabel lived in a bungalow in the village, and she had lived in that bungalow for more than 50 years. She used to live there with her husband, who was a vet. However, at the time of this case taking place, Mabel was living alone because her husband had passed away, so she was a widow. From what I can gather, Mabel didn't really have many people in her life. She and her husband didn't have any children, so I don't think she really had many, if any, family members left. She was very much alone most of the time in her bungalow. She never really had many visitors, but by all accounts, she didn't mind this at all. She actually really enjoyed her own company. She was incredibly independent. She was described as being very polite to people, but she was also pretty quiet and reserved. She kept herself to herself for the most part, but she was still a very respected member of the local community. Most people didn't necessarily know Mabel personally, but they did know of her, and people spoke very highly of her. For a 90-year-old woman, Mabel was actually in very good health. She did have some trouble with her eyesight and she was hard of hearing, but on the whole, she was a healthy elderly woman. And by all accounts, she was happy. She was content with her life. But in November of 2001, her life was cut short as Mabel became the target of a vicious and random attack. It was around 12:30 p.m. on Sunday the 25th of November 2001 when there was a knock at Mabel Leyshon's door. It was a woman, a Meals on Wheels lady, that had come to Mabel's home to deliver her lunch. I believe Mabel got a lunch delivered every single day, as a lot of elderly people do, because she was old, so it was difficult to make her own food sometimes. So this woman knocked on Mabel's door with her food. However, there was no answer. Mabel wasn't opening the door. Now, this woman knew Mabel. She knew that she did have some trouble with her hearing, and so she just assumed that Mabel couldn't hear the knock at the front door. And so she decided to walk around the back of Mabel's bungalow to see if maybe a window was open or if maybe the back door was open. However, when she walked round the back, she noticed that there was some glass on the ground. Mabel had these like big French windows at the back of her house, and one of these windows had been smashed. So immediately this woman was concerned. She assumed that someone had tried to break into Mabel's home, and so she got out her phone and she contacted the police. A couple of police officers were sent to Mabel's home, and when they arrived, they also knocked on Mabel's front door. But again, there was no answer from Mabel. So they went round the back of the property where the French window had been smashed, and one of the officers actually climbed into the house. As soon as she got inside, she began just walking around. She walked through the dining room and the hallway, and eventually she came across the living room. The first thing the officer noticed about the living room was that the curtains were closed, so it was quite dark in there. However, there was like a reddish glow from a lamp or a light that was switched on. And the second thing she noticed was an elderly lady sitting in an armchair. However, this lady had a blanket covering her body. It was pulled right up over her head, so her face was covered. And so the officer walked up to this lady and she pulled this blanket down, and when she did, she realised that she was dead, and that this lady was Mabel Leyshon. However, 90-year-old Mabel Leyshon hadn't died from natural causes, from old age, as you might expect. It was actually very obvious from looking at her body that Mabel had been murdered, and in a very, very brutal way. So this police officer called for backup, and Mabel's bungalow was cordoned off since it was now a crime scene. And detectives and forensic examiners got dressed in forensic suits and they entered the property. Just like the first officer did, they found Mabel Leyshon's dead body kind of slumped in her armchair with a blanket covering her. And it was obvious what her cause of death was. Mabel was absolutely covered in blood, and she had several stab wounds pretty much all over her body, mainly in her chest and neck area. I believe she had sustained around 22 stab wounds, and this was an elderly woman. She wouldn't have been able to put up a fight and defend herself, so she most likely would have been dead after the first few stabs, but for some reason this killer just kept carrying on. There was clearly a lot of anger and aggression in this attack. But that wasn't all the killer did. They hadn't just stabbed Mabel. Whoever had done this had actually mutilated her body. They had cut open her chest cavity and removed her heart. Her heart was no longer inside of her body. After looking around the crime scene, detectives noticed that on the floor close to Mabel's body, there were some poker sticks that are used for like a fireplace. And these poker sticks were kind of positioned to look like a cross. And then around this cross, there were some candlesticks. The police said it literally looked like someone had tried to make a shrine next to Mabel's dead body. Another object that they found on the floor that was to the left of the armchair was a small milk pan, and inside this pan was some newspaper which was absolutely covered in blood. But there was something wrapped inside this newspaper, and when the police unwrapped it, they realised that it was Mabel Leyshon's heart. So the perpetrator had killed Mabel, cut her heart out of her chest, and then for some reason wrapped it in newspaper and placed it in a milk pan. And of course this really confused the police. This whole scene really confused the police. Detective Superintendent John Clayton said that it was the strangest crime scene he had ever encountered. Now, not only had Mabel's heart been cut out of her chest, but the heart itself had also been cut. The top of it had been cut in a way that made it seem like the killer had tried to squeeze the blood out of it. And the police believe that the killer had cut the top of this heart and squeezed the blood into the milk pan that was found at the scene, because there were some marks and stains in the pan where blood had been. However, by this point, the blood in the pan was gone, and at first the police couldn't work out where it had gone. They thought that maybe the killer had tipped it down the sink in the home or maybe down the toilet, but no traces of blood were ever found in the sink or the toilet. However, eventually they noticed that on the side of this pan there was a lip mark, as if somebody had placed their lips on the pan, which led the detectives to believe that the killer had consumed this blood. They squeezed blood from Mabel's heart into the milk pan and then they drank it. And then afterwards they wrapped Mabel's heart in the newspaper and they placed it inside this pan, which is how the police found it. So immediately after the discovery of Mabel's body, a major investigation was launched by North Wales Police, and they knew that they had to find whoever had done this quickly, because if they didn't, there was a good chance that they would kill again. And as I'm sure you've probably guessed, the local community were absolutely shocked and terrified when they heard that a murder had taken place in this small village in Anglesey, because not only was this usually an incredibly safe and friendly area, but also the victim was literally a 90-year-old woman. A 90-year-old woman who didn't have any enemies and who didn't have the ability to defend herself. The killer had literally targeted a member of one of the most vulnerable groups in society, elderly people, and they didn't even know just how horrific and vicious this crime was. The North Wales police made the decision not to tell the media and the public the gruesome details of this case, like Mabel's heart being removed. All the community really knew about Mabel's death was that it was a murder inquiry, but the police didn't really tell them any more than that because they didn't want to cause a huge panic. But regardless, people were still panicked and they pretty much stopped leaving their houses, especially at night, particularly old people. They just stayed at home all the time out of fear. Meanwhile, detectives and scientists were still examining evidence from the crime scene. They were hopeful that they would be able to find traces of the killer's DNA. Unfortunately, they were unable to find any fingerprints. However, what they did find was some shoe prints in the home. There were some shoe prints on a broken piece of glass, on a piece of slate, and also on the carpet, and the police believed that these were the killer's shoe prints. As well as this, the police also found some fibres, and these fibres were found on the broken glass and the lower pane of the French windows. The French windows that had been broken, the police believe this was how the killer got into Mabel's house, by smashing the window and climbing inside. So yeah, they found some fibres from the glass and the lower pane, and these fibres were found to have come from a denim piece of clothing, obviously indicating that the attacker was wearing denim. And these denim fibres were also found in other parts of the house where the killer had walked and brushed past things. In addition to these pieces of evidence, the police were also able to determine what weapon was used to kill Mabel and remove her heart. The weapon was never found at the scene, so the killer had taken it away with them, but based on Mabel's injuries, they could tell that the murder weapon was probably a 6-inch long bladed knife with a single cutting edge. So now the police knew what kind of knife to look out for. Now, as I said earlier on, there was blood absolutely everywhere at the scene. There were blood stains everywhere, and so after Mabel's body was discovered, these blood stains were collected as evidence and sent off for forensic testing. And within literally 2 days of these blood stains being sent off, the results had come back, and it was found that pretty much all of this blood at the scene matched the victim's DNA profile. It was all Mabel's blood. But there was one trace of DNA in a blood stain in Mabel's blood that was found at the scene that wasn't a match to Mabel's DNA. It was someone else's DNA profile, and when tested, it was found to have come from a male. So the police believed that this was the killer's DNA. Now, this blood stain was a contact stain, and it was found on a windowsill near where the police believe the killer left the property. So it was like the killer had Mabel's blood on him somewhere, and he touched the windowsill, and this blood and his DNA then transferred onto the surface. So this discovery was a huge relief for the police. It meant that this investigation was hopefully going to be a lot easier because they had the offender's DNA, so they could test it against any potential suspects and narrow down their search for Mabel Leyshon's killer. The police started theorising who the killer might have been. They knew from the bloodstain that it was a male, but what man would have wanted to do this to Mabel? Who would want to kill a vulnerable old woman? Had Mabel been targeted? Did someone have something against her? Or was this just a random murder? Did the killer set out to kill anyone that night and Mabel was just unlucky? After looking into Mabel and her life, the police couldn't find anyone that would have wanted to do this to her. I mean, like I said earlier, she didn't really have anyone in her life. She didn't have any family. I don't think she really had many friends. She was very much on her own. She rarely left her home, to be honest. So it didn't seem like she had been targeted. It seemed like she had been murdered by just a complete stranger. Well, they thought that the killer was probably a stranger to Mabel, but maybe not necessarily to the area. If the killer was just a random stranger who didn't have any connection or knowledge about the area, then they couldn't have known that an elderly lady lived in that house. For all the killer knew, the person living in that house could have been a 6 foot tall, physically fit, strong young man that could easily overpower someone and defend themselves. But an elderly lady who was partially blind and hard of hearing would not stand a chance. And that's clearly what the killer wanted. They wanted to murder someone who wouldn't be able to put up a fight. So whilst the police think that the killer probably wasn't someone that Mabel knew personally, they did theorize that it was someone that knew the area well. They knew that an elderly person lived in that house on their own, and that's why they chose that victim. They believed that the perpetrator was someone that lived in this village, which of course only made the local community more scared. Not only had a member of the community been brutally murdered, but the murderer was most likely a member of the community too. There was a killer amongst them. And so with this theory in mind, this theory about the killer being a local, the police started conducting door-to-door inquiries. So they were going to every single home in the area and questioning people, asking them if they had any information related to this murder. However, this resulted in very little leads. They also asked every single male between the ages of 18 and 60 to come forward and provide a DNA sample that could be tested against the DNA the scientists had found of the killer. And whilst these samples were being collected and tested, the detectives also asked for help from criminal behavioural psychologists. They basically wanted these psychologists to look at all of the evidence and go through all of the details about this crime and then come up with a profile of their murderer, what kind of person this man was. So they did just that. They went through all of the details, and the psychologists concluded that the killer was probably someone that didn't really fit in with people. They were probably a loner, they didn't have many friends, and that they either lived on their own or they still lived with their parents. They thought that the killer may have been suffering from schizophrenia and that they may have had a, quote, out of the ordinary background. I'm not entirely sure what they meant by that, an out of the ordinary background. I'm guessing they just mean someone who perhaps didn't have a very stable upbringing, because that is something that we see a lot in killers and serial killers. Often their childhood years were not the best. So this was the kind of person that they were looking for, and just over a week after Mabel's death, the police came across their first potential suspect. Or not so much a suspect, more a person of interest, someone that they wanted to look into in case they had anything to do with this inquiry. Just the week after Mabel Leyshon was killed, a local man sadly took his own life by pouring petrol over himself, setting himself alight, and then jumping off the Britannia Bridge in Wales, which was very close to Mabel's home. It was about 400 meters away, and his body was later found at the base of the Britannia Bridge. This man was 37 years old, and after news of his suicide began to spread around the local area, rumours quickly formed. The media started suggesting that maybe this man was Mabel Leyshon's murderer and that he was feeling guilty about what he did, and so he decided to kill himself. And this rumour actually started to make the local people feel a bit more at ease. People really started to believe this story. They really believed that this suicide victim was the killer, and they suddenly felt safe again. They believed that the killer was dead. And so the police decided to look into this theory. They went to the man's parents' home and they found some suicide notes that he had written for his family, and they also found a poem in Welsh that he had picked out. Now this poem was an extract from the Bible, and it talked about the heart, and if you remember, Mabel's heart was cut out. So the detectives were immediately concerned and suspicious. They were thinking that maybe this poem that this man had picked out was a reference to Mabel's murder, but of course that is pretty far-fetched. It's not concrete evidence at all. It's not even really circumstantial evidence. It doesn't prove that this man was the murderer, and so the police had to keep investigating this lead. A few days after this man took his own life, the police went to the Britannia Bridge and they started looking for this man's shoe prints, because as we know, the killer's shoe prints were found at the murder scene. So they wanted to see if his shoe prints were a match to the shoe prints left behind by the offender. However, it was eventually determined that his prints were not the same. His shoes were not a match to the shoe prints found inside Mabel's home. But I mean, that doesn't rule him out entirely. It doesn't mean he is not the killer, because he could have just been wearing different shoes that he got rid of after the murder, and so the police continued looking into him as a person of interest. They collected several items from his house, which included some of his clothing, and these items were taken in for forensic examination. However, they didn't find anything. They had absolutely no evidence linking this man to the murder of Mabel Leyshon, and so he was completely ruled out as being a suspect in this investigation. So with this man eliminated from the inquiry, the police were now back to square one. The real killer was still on the loose, and by this point it had been about 2 weeks since Mabel's death. Now, as we know, one of the key pieces of evidence the detectives had in this case was the shoe prints that the killer had left at the crime scene. And so the police began working on trying to identify what kind of shoe had made these prints. They knew that it was a trainer, but they wanted to know exactly what kind of trainer it was, and they soon determined that it was a trainer made by the brand Levi. And this specific Levi trainer model didn't sell that well. The sales weren't great across the UK, which was obviously not great for the brand, but it was good news for the police in this case, because that meant that not many people would have owned these trainers, so it kind of narrows down their search. The police now knew that, number one, the killer was probably a local, and number two, that they must have purchased and owned these Levi shoes at some point. And the police soon found out that the only place that actually sold these shoes locally was a shop in nearby Bangor, which is in northwest Wales. So the police went to this shop in Bangor and they asked them about these specific trainers, and the shop were able to tell the police that they had only sold 53 pairs of them. 48 of these pairs were paid for using credit cards, and the remaining 5 were paid for in cash. And so the next thing the detectives had to do was try to track down every single person, all 53 people that had purchased those trainers from that shop, and hopefully that way they might be able to identify the killer. Of course, this was going to take a while though. They had to find every single person that had brought these shoes and then determine whether they or anyone they knew could have had anything to do with this case. So this was going to be a long process, and soon it had been almost a month since the murder of 90-year-old Mabel Leyshon, and still the police didn't have a main suspect, or any suspect really. The police had a couple of different lines of inquiry in this investigation. As I just said, they were trying to track down everyone who had purchased the Levi trainers. They were also looking into different people that could have used or owned the kind of knife that was used to stab Mabel, including butchers. They were thinking that the killer could have been a butcher that had access to many different knives, and they were still collecting DNA samples from all of the men in the area that were aged between 18 and 60, and these samples were being tested against the killer's DNA. But unfortunately, so far, no match had been found. And so because this investigation was moving pretty slowly, the police decided to launch another appeal to the public 4 weeks after Mabel's murder. They did an appeal when the murder first happened, but like I mentioned earlier, the police didn't really tell the public too much. They didn't tell them the gruesome details about Mabel's death. They held that back because they didn't want to cause a massive panic. But now it was a month in and they were getting desperate. They needed the public's help with this case. And so on the 20th of December, during an episode of Crime Watch, they told everyone exactly what had happened to Mabel, that her heart had been removed after she was dead. They were hopeful that by releasing this information, it might encourage more people to come forward with potential leads. And it worked. After the Crime Watch episode, the police received roughly 200 calls with potential leads. But there was one lead in particular that would prove to be very significant, would prove to be the breakthrough that the police had been waiting for in this case. This lead came from a young girl who was a foreign exchange student from Germany, but at the time of this case taking place, she was in Wales on her foreign exchange trip. And she told the police that one day in September of 2001, so just a couple of months before Mabel's murder, she was at a party with a couple of local boys that were around the same age as her. And she said that while she was at this party, one of the boys was just being really strange. She said that this boy asked her to bite him so that she could become a vampire. But he wasn't joking around, he was being deadly serious. This girl obviously said no, but he would not stop asking, and eventually he was told to just leave the house because he was creeping her out so much. However, he refused to leave, and so the police were called. And when the police arrived to remove him, he actually asked if one of the officers could bite his neck. The boy was never charged with anything in relation to this incident. However, months later, when this girl, this foreign exchange student, heard about the fact that Mabel Leyshon's heart had been cut from her chest, she thought that maybe this strange boy could have had a link to the case because he was so obsessed with vampires, and so she decided to get in contact with the police. And the police took this lead very seriously because they believed that the motive for Mabel's murder probably had something to do with her blood. If you remember from earlier on in the video, there were lip marks on the milk pan that Mabel's heart had been placed in, where the police believe the killer had drank her blood from the pan. And here was this boy who also seemed to have an interest in blood. He wanted to bite people's necks, I don't know. So the police were really eager to investigate this lead, investigate this boy, who they soon found out was called Matthew Hardman. Matthew Hardman was a 17-year-old art student who was described by people that knew him as just being a little bit odd. I don't think he really had too many friends. He was a bit of a loner. There isn't really any information online that I could find anyway about Matthew's life, like his upbringing, his childhood, so I'm sorry I can't include any of that. From what I can gather, the police did actually speak to Matthew about the murder after it happened, but that wasn't unusual. Pretty much every single person in that village was spoken to. Like I said, they did do door-to-door inquiries afterwards. They didn't think he was suspicious at the time, and of course because he was 17 and not 18, they hadn't asked him to provide a DNA sample to be tested against the killer's DNA. But now they had received this lead about him, and so on January the 5th, 2002, they decided to go and visit him at his home where he lived with his mother, which was only about 200 meters away from Mabel's home. And they just questioned Matthew about the case. They asked him pretty much the same questions that they asked when they first spoke to him about the crime. They asked him if he knew Mabel, had he ever been to her house, and he said no in response to both of those questions. However, this time, so the second time he was being asked these questions, his mother was present, and she actually corrected Matthew. She said, yes, you have been to Mabel's house before. You see, Matthew was the local delivery boy, and he had been the delivery boy for several years. He first started delivering newspapers in late 1996, and pretty much every time, or most times that he was on a paper round, he would deliver a newspaper to Mabel's home. So he had been there many, many times by this point. So he had lied. He previously said that he had never been to Mabel's house before, but he had. So why did he lie? Well, when the officers asked him why he had lied, he said that he just didn't think it was important to tell them. He didn't think it was significant, which already makes him seem quite suspicious, because why wouldn't you just tell them? It's up to the police whether something is significant or not, so why not just tell them everything you know, unless you are trying to hide something from them? Anyway, after this, the police asked Matthew if he could remember the last time he had delivered a newspaper to Mabel's home, and once again, he lied. Initially, he said that he hadn't delivered a newspaper to Mabel's house in a few years, but his mother said, no, that's not right. You delivered a paper there not long before her death. It was somewhere between like a few weeks to a month before she died. This boy had lied to the police twice now, and so of course the police were very concerned and suspicious of Matthew Hardman, and they knew that they had to keep looking into this lead. The police decided to see if they could somehow link Matthew to the Levi trainers that had made the shoe prints at the crime scene, and so they asked him if they could have a look at every single pair of shoes that he owned. And so Matthew took the police up to his bedroom and he showed them his shoes, and he had quite a few pairs of shoes. However, there was one pair that really stuck out to the police. They immediately noticed that he had a pair of Levi trainers, the same type of trainers that had made the shoe prints. Now, the officers knew in that moment that they needed to take those trainers. They needed to be collected as potential evidence. However, they didn't want to scare Matthew. They were very suspicious of him at this point, but they didn't want him to know that, and so they just told him that because he had a connection to Mabel's home, they needed to take all of his shoes to be tested so they could be eliminated from the inquiry. And alongside the shoes, they also took a sample of Matthew's DNA. So as you've probably guessed, Matthew Hardman was a solid suspect by this time. He was pretty much the main suspect in this investigation. They didn't necessarily have any evidence linking him directly to the murder at this point, but as I've said many times, he was just so suspicious. The fact that he had lied about having gone to the victim's home before, twice, not just once, he lied twice, was just very unusual. And also, he had the Levi trainers that we know only 53 people had owned or purchased locally, and he was one of them. But like I said, none of this was concrete evidence, so they couldn't arrest him for anything just yet. And so whilst they were waiting for the results from his DNA sample and the trainers, the detectives decided to just keep a close eye on the 17-year-old. They had a surveillance team just watch him constantly, and then they would report back to the police what his movements were. And one of the things that the surveillance team noticed about Matthew Hardman was that he was pretty much the only person in this area that would still walk around at night on his own. Everyone else in the village was just too terrified to go out at night because a killer was on the loose. But he didn't seem to care. He didn't seem to be scared at all. Perhaps because he was the killer? 2 days after Matthew's shoes were collected, the police had the results back from these tests, the tests relating to his trainers, and they found that his Levi trainers were in fact an exact match to the footprints that had been left at the crime scene. And this was enough evidence for the police to be able to arrest 17-year-old Matthew Hardman on suspicion of the murder of Mabel Leyshon. He was arrested on the 18th of January 2002, so just under 2 months after Mabel's death, and he was taken into custody. And whilst he was being questioned, another team of officers went to search his home to see if they could find any more evidence linking him to the crime. And during this search of his home, they found a black jacket that belonged to Matthew. And inside of this jacket, in one of the pockets, they discovered a long, slim knife, which looked exactly like the knife the police believe was used to stab Mabel and cut out her heart. So they collected this knife as evidence, and they also seized Matthew's laptop, which was going to be examined by a team of experts. In addition to these items, the police also found a pair of blue denim jeans, a Kagul style waterproof jacket or top that had some latex gloves in the pocket, and also a meat cleaver. And so these items were also taken in for testing. Matthew Hardman's interviews with the detectives went on for a couple of days because he would not say anything. He never admitted to the murder. He remained very calm in the interviews, but in a way kind of chillingly calm. It was almost like he was completely emotionless. He just seemed very uninterested, like he didn't care. The only time he actually seemed a bit uncomfortable was when the detectives told him that they had found traces of the killer's DNA at the crime scene. If you remember, the killer's DNA was found in a stain of Mabel's blood on a windowsill. And that was the only time that he seemed a little bit nervous when they mentioned the DNA. Whilst detectives were questioning Matthew, scientists were conducting tests on his DNA sample to determine whether or not it was a match to the killer's DNA. And when these results came back, they would prove to be even more evidence against him. His DNA was a match to the DNA that was found on the windowsill, and so now the police had enough evidence to charge 17-year-old Matthew Hardman with murder. News of this arrest quickly spread around the community, and the local people were absolutely stunned. They could not believe that a 17-year-old boy, a child, could have committed this brutal murder. It really sent shockwaves throughout the area. Matthew Hardman decided to plead not guilty to the charges. He was still denying any involvement in this crime, and so the case had to go to trial. His trial began at Mold Crown Court in July of 2002, so about 8 months after Mabel's death, and it lasted for roughly 3 weeks. During the trial, the prosecution presented all of their evidence to the jury, the evidence that linked Hardman to the crime, and by this point, the police had obtained quite a lot of evidence against him. So with this evidence in mind, the prosecution pieced together what they believe happened on the night that Mabel was killed, and they talked through their version of events. They believed that Matthew Hardman carefully planned this murder. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. He planned to kill someone that night, and he wanted his victim to be someone that he knew wouldn't be able to fight back. And of course, being the local delivery boy, he knew the area very well. He knew which people lived in which houses. He knew that 90-year-old Mabel Leyshon lived in a bungalow on her own, so she was the perfect victim to him. And so on the night of the 24th of November 2001, once it was dark outside, the prosecution believe Matthew went to Mabel's home and he was armed with a knife. Based on the evidence, obviously Mabel's French window had been smashed. Based on this, they believe that he walked around the back of Mabel's home, he picked up a piece of slate from her garden and he threw it through the bottom pane of glass on her French window. And then they think that he got on his hands and knees knees and he crawled inside of the home. Once he got inside, he just walked around Mabel's home until he came across her in the living room. She was sitting in her armchair and she was just watching the television, none the wiser that he was standing behind her because of course she was hard of hearing, so she didn't hear him breaking into her home. Matthew then got out his knife and he approached Mabel from behind and the attack began. He just began stabbing her repeatedly. I believe the first or one of the first stab wounds was through her shoulder blade. As I said earlier, Mabel was stabbed 22 times in total. However, it's believed that she did die quickly. She would have died after the first couple because one of the early stab wounds did actually puncture her heart. After she was dead, it was determined that Matthew had tried to just cut and slash her body. It's believed that he was doing this to try and get some blood from her, but of course because she was dead, her heart had stopped. It had stopped pumping blood around her body. He tried to slash the back of her legs to get some blood out, but of course because she was dead, it wasn't really working. And so the prosecution believed that in that moment, he decided to cut open Mabel's chest and remove her heart. Once he had cut out the heart, he then cut the top of the heart itself and he squeezed the blood out of it and into a milk pan that he had grabbed from the kitchen. And once he had squeezed it into this pan, he drank the blood. He then wrapped the heart in newspaper, he placed it back in the milk pan, and after this he set up a sort of shrine using candlesticks and poker sticks. Following this, he covered Mabel's body with a blanket and then he just left. He went back home and he went back to normal life, I suppose, after having just committed such a brutal and gruesome murder. But why did he do this? What was the motive here? Why would a 17-year-old boy want to kill and mutilate an elderly woman? Well, like I said earlier, the police and the prosecution believed that the motive for this murder was simply blood. They believed that Mabel had been killed for her blood. You see, Matthew Hardman was obsessed with vampires, and this was a very, very unhealthy obsession. If you remember from earlier on in the video, just a few months before Mabel's murder in September of 2001, he asked that girl, that foreign exchange student from Germany, if she could bite his neck so that she would become a vampire. And then when the police were called because he wouldn't leave the house, he asked one of the officers if they could bite his neck. I don't know if he genuinely thought that he was a vampire or if he just really desperately wanted to be one. During the trial, the prosecution also presented evidence that they had found on Matthew's laptop. Remember, the police seized it when he was arrested so that it could be examined. And it was found on his laptop that he would just constantly search up vampires. He had visited many different websites that were about vampires. But as well as this, they found that he had also done quite a lot of research into forensic science and DNA. Although I'm not sure if he did this before or after the murder, but if it was before, then that shows you just how planned this crime actually was. After the prosecution had presented their evidence, it was then the defence's turn to give their side, and the defense claimed that Matthew wasn't obsessed with vampires as the prosecution had suggested. He was just interested in them as many other teenagers were. Now, as we know, the prosecution's case was very much centered around the forensic evidence, and so the defense had the task of somehow trying to explain away this forensic evidence. One of the pieces of forensic evidence that the police had was Matthew's DNA being found in a blood stain on a windowsill in Mabel's home. The defense tried to explain this by saying that this DNA was transferred when Matthew was delivering a newspaper one day to Mabel. They said that at some point he must have touched her windowsill when he was on her paper round, and that was how his DNA ended up there. But what about about the knife that was found in Matthew's jacket after he was arrested. The police firmly believed that this knife was the knife that was used to kill Mabel, and Matthew didn't deny that it was his. He admitted that it was his knife. However, he said that he only started carrying it around with him after the murder because a murder had just occurred in the village and a killer was on the loose. Now, when the police first discovered this knife in Matthew's jacket, it appeared as though it was clean. They didn't notice any blood on it. However, what they did notice was that the handle of the knife was actually damaged. The handle was slightly split open, and when this knife was sent off for testing, scientists actually found 2 traces of DNA on the handle, so 2 people's DNA. One of these DNA traces on the handle was a match to Matthew Hardman, which makes sense because it was his knife. However, the other trace of DNA was found to be a match to Mabel Leyshon, and the police believe that this DNA had probably come from Mabel's blood cells. So that is very damning evidence against Matthew Hardman. He had to have been her killer, or why else would her DNA be on his knife? While the defense tried to explain this evidence away by claiming that there had been some contamination between Matthew's belongings that were taken from his home and items and evidence that were taken from the crime scene, Mabel's home. They tried to claim that items such as the knife from Matthew's home had been transported to the science lab for testing with items from Mabel's home, and that during this, some sort of contamination must have occurred. However, the science lab could prove that this just wasn't true. They could prove that the evidence from both the crime scene and from Matthew's home had always been kept separate throughout this whole process, and so no contamination could have occurred. This was clearly just the defence's final desperate attempt at trying to persuade the jury that Matthew Hardman was innocent. However, the evidence linking him to the crime was just too overwhelming. They had Matthew's DNA on the bloodstain in the windowsill. They had the knife, which had Mabel's DNA on it. The prosecution also had the shoe print evidence. Shoe prints were left at the crime scene by a pair of Levi trainers, and Matthew Hardman owned these exact trainers. And although this piece of evidence isn't necessarily concrete, it is more circumstantial evidence against him. They had the evidence from the foreign exchange student and from his laptop that highlighted his obsession with blood and vampires. And again, although this isn't concrete evidence, it is more circumstantial evidence just piling up. At the end of the trial, after the jury had heard from both the prosecution and the defense, they went off to deliberate, and it only took them about 4 hours to reach a verdict. On the 2nd of August 2002, they found Matthew Hardman guilty of the murder of 90-year-old Mabel Leyshon, and he was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum of just 12 years. The reason his minimum sentence is low, by the way, is because he was technically a child when he committed the crime. I believe he was 18 by this point, but at the time of the murder he was just 17, and so he received a smaller minimum sentence, but it is still life in prison. And of course, by now in 2021 he has served that minimum sentence and he is still in prison to this day. Apparently he will not become eligible for parole until he confesses. It's been years and years since this crime, and he has still never admitted his guilt, and until he does, he won't become eligible for parole because he hasn't displayed any remorse. And that is it for this case. That is the case of 90-year-old Mabel Leyshon. A really, really crazy one. As soon as I came across this case, I was baffled, and I knew that I had to share it with you guys. So please do let me know your thoughts and opinions in the comments. Before I go, I do just want to say a huge thank you once again to NordVPN for kindly sponsoring this video. Remember, you can go to nordvpn.com/Molly or use my code, which is just Molly, to get a 2-year plan with a huge discount plus 1 additional month for free. I also just want to give a special shout out to the lovely members of my Patreon page. Thank you so much for your support, guys. If anyone else wants to become a member of our little Patreon family, then the link is always in the description box of my videos. Thank you so much for watching this video. Please do give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and I will see you again next week for another mystery with Molly. Bye guys!